I paid for my sister's wedding $18,000, then got kicked out for bringing my wife, so I shut the whole thing down and I never expected a wedding invitation to feel like a silent ultimatum. But when my father called asking me to return to Clearwater for a family discussion, I already knew it wasn't going to be about love or unity. It was going to be about control, money, and appearances. I was 35, living in St. Louis, with a stable job as a senior financial strategist, and married to Ivy, the most grounded, warm-hearted woman I'd ever met. She wasn't flashy, didn't wear labels, didn't try to impress anyone, and maybe that was why my mother hated her. My mother, Darlene, had always lived for the opinions of neighbors, colleagues, even strangers on the sidewalk. Everything she did, from the way she decorated the house to the people she invited to our Thanksgiving dinners, was curated for approval. When I told her I was marrying a schoolteacher from a modest background, she gave me a smile so brittle I could hear it crack across the phone line. Ivy didn't come from wealth. Her family ran a small furniture repair business 2 towns over. But she had patience for children I couldn't imagine replicating, a laugh that melted every ounce of cynicism from my chest, and a backbone she didn't always show, but I knew was there. The day I got the call, I had just wrapped up an early client meeting and was heading back to my apartment when my phone buzzed. I nearly ignored it, but something in me said pick it up. Martin, my father, didn't usually call unless there was something he couldn't talk about in a voicemail. His voice came through calm, but with that clipped tone he used when he didn't want to show urgency. You should come home soon. It's about Brooke. It's better if we talk in person. I hadn't seen my sister Brooke in over a year, not since the night she posted a blurry photo of her engagement ring with the caption, "Next chapter begins." I sent a quick congratulations via text. She didn't reply, but I didn't expect her to. After everything that happened the year before at Ivy's first visit to my parents' house, there'd been a widening silence between me and my family that no one had tried to fix. And frankly, I hadn't either. When I drove back to Clearwater 2 days later, I left Ivy at home. Not because she didn't want to come, but because I refused to bring her back into that house after what they'd said to her. During Brooke's birthday dinner the year before, my mother had gone off mid-conversation, right in front of Ivy and half the table, saying, "Teaching kindergarten isn't a real job. It's just crowd control for toddlers." I had watched Ivy freeze mid-sip, lower her cup with a trembling hand, and offer a smile that said, "I'm not hurt," even though I knew she was. I had stood up quietly, pulled out Ivy's chair, and told my mother, "If you can't show her respect, then we don't belong at this table." We walked out together, and we never went back. That was the day I stopped being the dutiful, agreeable son. That was also the moment my mother's hatred for Ivy grew teeth. So when I arrived back at my childhood home, I wasn't surprised by the first thing Darlene said. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask how work was or if I wanted coffee. She just looked around me and said, "You didn't bring that girl, did you?" The way she said that girl felt like spitting on a photograph. I kept my voice steady and told her, "Say something like that again, and I won't step inside this house again." She didn't respond, just pressed her lips together like a purse being zipped shut. A few minutes later, my father came out of the kitchen and led me into the living room, where Brooke sat on the couch, legs crossed, fidgeting with the edge of a throw pillow. Her eyes flicked up briefly when I walked in, then dropped again like she didn't want to see the disappointment in mine. Martin took the lead. "Brooke's getting married. Ceremony's in 5 weeks. We're in the middle of planning." His tone shifted, slower now. "And she's pregnant. 2 months along." I nodded slowly, more surprised that they told me than by the news itself. My father continued, clearing his throat. "We've run into a bit of a financial snag. Work's been dry lately, and Brooke's between jobs. We were wondering if you could help with the expenses, about $18,000. That would cover the venue, reception, and dress." I looked straight at Brooke, not angry, not judging, just wondering how she, a woman who had worked nearly 3 years, had nothing saved. She didn't answer, just shifted in her seat like my gaze was a spotlight. Darlene jumped in, sharp and defensive. "She's been helping with bills, student loans, everyday expenses. Not everyone has your salary, Grant." I didn't respond right away. The room was quiet, like it was holding its breath. I nodded. All right, I'll help. Their relief was almost physical. Darlene unclenched her hands. Brooke let out a slow exhale. But I wasn't done. I leaned forward, voice even but unmistakable. But I'm not handing over cash. I'll sign the contracts myself. All payments go directly to the venue and vendors. No middlemen. My father glanced at Darlene, who tried to hide the flash of irritation behind a tight-lipped smile. Brooke still hadn't said a word. They agreed. Reluctantly, but they agreed. I think they knew that was the only way it was going to happen. And I wasn't doing this for them. I was doing it for Brooke. For the girl who once made me a birthday card from torn notebook paper and said I was her superhero. 3 days later, I picked her up in my car, and we drove across town to tour the venue. Everything went smoothly. I handled every transaction, signed each document, got every receipt emailed to my personal account. I wasn't paranoid. I was just experienced. Years ago, I sent my parents $2,000 for what they said was an urgent dental procedure for my father. A week later, I dropped by to find a new espresso machine in the kitchen and brochures for a couple's cruise in the hallway. That was the last time I sent money without oversight. By the time we finished booking the reception hall and choosing the dress, Brooke seemed genuinely happy. She walked out of the boutique with her dress in hand, smiling like a girl who believed in magic again. That night, I drove home through the city with Jazz playing low and Ivy waiting for me in the kitchen, stirring soup with her hair pulled up in a lazy bun. I thought maybe, just maybe, things were shifting. Maybe my mother would realize what I'd done wasn't for recognition, but for love. Maybe they'd see Ivy not as an outsider, but as the woman who made me whole. I should have known better. 3 days before the wedding, I was standing by the office coffee machine when my phone lit up with my mother's name, and for reasons I still don't understand, I answered without hesitation. I should have known better by now, but part of me still thought maybe, just maybe, she was calling to say something human. Maybe an apology. Maybe even a rare thank you. But the moment I picked up, her voice came sharp, cold, and rehearsed like she was reading from a script. The wedding's this Saturday. I expect you to be there. But don't bring that woman. Understood. She didn't say Ivy's name. She didn't even call her my wife. She said, that woman, like Ivy was some passing shadow I'd picked up off the street. Someone temporary, someone disposable. I stood there holding my paper cup, coffee growing cold in my hand, and tried to find a calm place in my voice. Why not? I asked, not because I didn't already know the answer, but because I needed her to say it out loud. She didn't hesitate. She's not right for this family. Not with the way she dresses, not with the job she has. She's not one of us, Grant. You know that. She doesn't fit in. And I don't want people whispering about her during the reception. My fingers tightened around the cup, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not rage, not heartbreak, but a kind of finality I hadn't let myself feel before. I took a slow breath and said, if you keep talking about my wife that way, I won't be coming at all. Then I hung up without waiting for a reply. That night, I didn't tell Ivy what my mother said, not because I was hiding it, but because I knew she'd already heard it once in a different form. She didn't need to hear it again. Instead, we sat on the couch, the television humming in the background, our fingers intertwined without words. She must have known something was wrong because she leaned her head on my shoulder and stayed there a long time without speaking. On the morning of the wedding, I buttoned my shirt in front of the hallway mirror while Ivy stepped out of the bedroom in a soft blue dress that fit her like a whisper. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It was exactly her. Elegant, sincere, unafraid to be simple. She stood by the door fixing the clasp on her necklace, and then, out of nowhere, she paused, turned to me, and said, maybe you should go alone. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but those 6 words hit me like a train. I looked up from the mirror, stunned, and asked her what she meant. She didn't look at me right away. She kept her eyes on the floor, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress, and said, your family won't want me there. I don't want to be the reason something goes wrong on your sister's day. I crossed the room slowly, wrapped my arms around her waist, and rested my forehead against hers. No one is more out of place in that family than I am. And I'm not walking in without you. That was all I said, and she didn't argue again. She just nodded and kissed my hand like she was trying to give me a piece of her courage. We arrived at the venue about an hour before most of the guests. I wanted to see Brooke before everything started, make sure she felt supported, remind her she wasn't alone. Ivy walked beside me, quiet but composed, the kind of calm that only came from years of learning how to survive quietly in rooms that weren't built to welcome you. We made it past the entrance, nodded politely to a few staff members, and were just heading toward the bridal suite when we heard the sharp click of heels approaching from behind. I turned around, and there she was, Darlene, dressed in a fitted wine-colored dress, lips tight, expression unreadable. Her eyes landed on Ivy and immediately dropped like something had soured the air. She didn't say hello. She didn't even look at me. Her voice came out clipped and cold. "You too, come with me." Ivy reached for my hand instantly, and I gave it a squeeze to say, "I've got this." We followed Darlene down a narrow hallway behind the reception room, away from guests, away from cameras, away from anything that could soften what was about to happen. When we stopped, she turned sharply on her heel, crossed her arms, and said, "I told you not to bring her." She didn't even bother lowering her voice. She looked straight through Ivy like she was a smudge on glass. I stepped in front of my wife, kept my tone low, and said, "This is Brooke's wedding. I'm her brother. Ivy is my wife. Her being here is entirely appropriate." Darlene let out a bitter, humorless laugh and looked Ivy up and down like she was inspecting a piece of furniture she wouldn't buy. A wife who teaches alphabet songs and doesn't know the difference between satin and silk? I've bitten my tongue long enough. Today is not the day for charity cases in floral print. Ivy didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just stood there, quiet and steady, but I felt her hand go cold in mine. Something inside me snapped, not with anger, not with noise, but with an irreversible shift. I looked Darlene in the eye and said, "You are standing in a venue that I paid for, every inch of it, from the chair covers to the lighting. I didn't ask for a thank you. I didn't ask for recognition, but I won't be insulted in return." She sneered, as if the truth of that stung more than she expected. "You think dropping 18 grand gives you the right to do whatever you want?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. No, but I think it earns me the right to expect basic respect. And if you're not willing to give it, then maybe this event doesn't deserve to continue. The silence after that was heavier than anything she could have said. I think she believed I was bluffing, that I wouldn't dare ruin the wedding I helped fund, that I didn't have it in me to turn away. But what she didn't understand was I had already left once before, walked out of that house, walked away from the fantasy of family, walked toward a woman who never once made me feel like I had to prove my worth. So I turned on my heel, took Ivy's hand, and walked straight back to the front desk, past decorations I'd approved, past a catering team I had wired deposits to, past a florist I had signed a contract with. I asked to speak to the venue manager. When she arrived, I pulled up the contract and said, "As the signatory and financial holder, I want to invoke the closure clause. I want this event wrapped and vacated in 30 minutes. The manager's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded. She wasn't interested in drama, just the terms. She made a few calls, and then, a few minutes later, she walked with us toward the center of the reception room and announced, loud enough for every ear to catch it, "Per the contract holder's request, this event will be ending shortly. Guests, please prepare to vacate the premises. Staff will assist." The room fell dead silent. Martin and Darlene's heads whipped toward us. Brooke's face went pale. Chairs squeaked. Glasses clinked against tablecloths. And in that moment, I saw panic ripple across faces like a wave no one expected to crash. But I didn't move. I didn't blink. I stood beside my wife, hands still wrapped around hers, and waited for the fallout. My father reached us first, face flushed and jaw tight, his voice raised enough to pull attention from every corner of the reception hall, though most people had already stopped pretending not to watch. "Have you completely lost your mind, Grant? You're actually going through with this? You're shutting down your own sister's wedding." He didn't even look at Ivy, didn't glance at the guests slowly rising from their chairs, just stared at me like I had pulled the pin on a grenade in the middle of a family dinner. Before I could answer, Darlene stormed up beside him, her voice cutting through the thick tension like she was slicing open the air. "Who do you think you are? Canceling everything we've planned just because you feel insulted? You're making a scene, humiliating us in front of everyone." Her face was tight with rage, but beneath it I could see something else. Panic, the kind that sets in when people like her realize the narrative they've controlled for decades is finally slipping out of their hands. I looked at both of them, held their gaze without a twitch of emotion, and spoke as steadily as I could without raising my voice. "If you can't respect the woman I love, then you have no right to expect me to fund your celebration." The words hit harder than I anticipated. My father blinked like I'd slapped him. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. Around us, relatives whispered in hushed tones, some walking away, others frozen with the kind of stunned discomfort that only comes when a family's dirty secrets get dragged into the light in real time. Then Martin's voice dropped, less fury now, more desperation poorly disguised as logic. "If you do this, how are we supposed to face everyone? The groom's family is still on their way. You'll ruin Brooke's life before it even starts." I said nothing, not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't going to argue about blame with people who hadn't once taken responsibility for anything beyond their own appearances. Darlene finally stepped forward again, her tone softer this time, though I could see how much effort it took her to force it. "Please don't do this, Grant. I said things I shouldn't have, but this is Brooke's day. Don't punish her for what I said." It was the first thing she'd said all day that even hinted at reflection, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her. But I'd spent my entire life watching her switch faces depending on who was in the room, depending on how much she had to lose. I took a breath, steady and slow, then said calmly, "If you want this wedding to continue, you'll acknowledge the debt, sign a formal agreement, and stop pretending I owe you silence for the money I gave." My mother stiffened, her eyes wide with insult, as if the very suggestion was blasphemous. "You'd make your parents sign a loan document? Like we're strangers?" I kept my eyes on her, firm but detached, and replied, "You made that choice the moment you treated my wife like a mistake I should be ashamed of." There it was, the line I'd held back for years, the quiet truth that had been growing between us like a cracked foundation. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She just looked away, like she finally understood that this wasn't a threat I was making. It was a boundary I had built, and she had crossed it one too many times. 15 minutes later, we were in the private back office of the venue. The manager stood by the door, clipboard in hand, professional but clearly aware that she was witnessing a kind of emotional war she hadn't signed up for. I drafted the agreement in legal language, nothing complicated, just enough to state the total amount, the breakdown of expenses, and the terms of repayment. There would be no interest, no deadlines. But the signature meant acknowledgement. It meant they could never pretend again that I hadn't done this for them. Darlene signed first, barely hiding the way her hand trembled as she wrote her name. Martin followed, jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. When it was done, I took a photo of the signed page and emailed it to myself, then handed the original to the manager and told her the event could continue. They didn't thank me. They didn't look me in the eye. I walked out of that room with Ivy beside me, and we didn't return to the hall. We didn't stay for the first toast, or the dinner, or the dancing. Brooke called after us as we crossed the parking lot, her voice breaking, but I didn't stop walking, not because I didn't love her, but because I couldn't stay in a place where love came with conditions I was no longer willing to meet. After that night, I didn't hear from anyone in my family for nearly a month. No texts, no calls, no attempts at explanation or reconciliation. I handed all the documentation and receipts over to my attorney, not to escalate things, but to make sure that if they tried to twist the story, I'd be ready. I wasn't angry. I was finished. Ivy never once asked me how I felt about what happened. She just sat with me in the quiet days that followed, making coffee, playing music, brushing her hand against mine like a reminder that peace doesn't always come from victory. It comes from choosing not to let old wars keep bleeding into your new life. Then, one Saturday afternoon, just as I was getting back from a work meeting, the doorbell rang. I checked the peephole and saw Brooke standing there with a man I assumed was her husband. She was holding a small purse, dressed simply, and she looked smaller than I remembered, like something had been draining her slowly and silently. I opened the door, said nothing, and stepped aside to let them in. She didn't hug me. She didn't sit right away. She just stood there for a second before finally easing down onto the couch like her legs didn't quite trust the floor. Ivy was out shopping, which I think Brooke had somehow known. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope, set it gently on the table between us, and said, "We came to return the money." I stared at it. Didn't touch it. Just kept my eyes on her, waiting. Her hands fidgeted for a moment, and then she spoke again, softer this time. After the wedding, they blamed me. Said it was my fault you pulled out. That I should have kept you happy. But you asked me why I hadn't saved anything, and I didn't answer because I didn't want you to think I was just irresponsible. She looked up at me, and I saw something behind her eyes I hadn't seen since we were kids. Not guilt, not shame, just exhaustion. I've been covering their utilities for 2 years. Their prescriptions, the car insurance, even part of the property tax. I never told anyone. Just figured it was what I was supposed to do. And I don't regret it. But I wasn't ready to carry all of it. And I didn't ask for help because I knew it would just come with more noise. The envelope sat on the table like a symbol neither of us could ignore. I reached forward slowly, pushed it back toward her, and said, "This money wasn't for you. It was never about a dress or a venue. It was for the child you're carrying. Don't pay me back for doing something I'd do again if it meant that kid starts their life without debt hovering over their crib." That was when she broke. She didn't sob. She didn't scream. She just leaned forward, covered her face, and let the kind of tears fall that don't ask permission. I didn't move. Didn't try to stop her. Just let her cry, because some wounds don't need advice. They just need space to bleed. After a few minutes, she stood, said thank you without saying the words, and left with her husband. We didn't make promises. We didn't hug. But there was a look we exchanged as the door closed behind her that said everything we couldn't put into a sentence. And somehow that was enough. After Brooke left that afternoon, something inside me shifted, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in that quiet internal corner where the weight of every past decision finally settles and stops moving. I didn't tell Ivy right away about what Brooke had said or how she looked like someone who hadn't slept well in months. Not because I didn't trust Ivy with the truth, but because I wanted to give that moment space to breathe, to figure out if maybe something new had finally taken root between us siblings after all these years of pretending things were fine when they were anything but. For the next few weeks, there was no contact with my parents. No accidental calls. No emails pretending they didn't remember what happened. Not even a forwarded holiday card. It was as if the silence between us had turned into an agreement. One none of us signed, but everyone obeyed. Ivy didn't bring them up once, and I didn't either. We spent that winter in quiet, with small dinners, late movie nights, and mornings filled with the kind of peace I didn't know I had been missing until I tasted it for the first time. Then, about 2 months after the wedding, on a Sunday afternoon while I was pouring coffee and Ivy was folding laundry on the couch, the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and felt my jaw tighten the second I saw who it was. Darlene and Martin, standing side by side like statues, both dressed as if they were visiting a neighbor they wanted to impress. I opened the door slowly, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted them to know I had no intention of rushing this moment for their comfort. They didn't say much at first, just stepped inside and sat on the edge of the couch like they weren't sure if they were guests or intruders. Ivy wasn't home. She was visiting her sister across town, and part of me wondered if that timing was a coincidence or carefully calculated. My mother smiled the kind of smile you give strangers in elevators. My father stared at the floor for a few seconds before finally speaking. "We're planning to go into business with an old friend. A small restaurant project. We're looking for some startup support, around 40,000. We thought of you." I didn't react right away. I sat down across from them, set my coffee on the table, and let the silence sit there long enough to get uncomfortable. When I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice, didn't let emotion slip through. I just told them plainly, "I'm not saying no, but if I'm putting money into anything, I need collateral. The house you're living in, to be specific." Darlene looked up like I'd slapped her with the words. She laughed, soft and quick, like she was trying to erase the moment with some forced charm. "Grant, we're your parents. If you can't help, that's fine. But why treat us like we're strangers with paperwork? I leaned back slowly, arms crossed, eyes locked on hers, and said in the calmest tone I could manage, "The day you told me to get out of my sister's wedding was the day you made it clear there was no us anymore." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was final. They didn't argue. They didn't beg. They stood, their polite faces already slipping back into the ones I remembered too well, cold, proud, and unwilling to admit they had ever been wrong. They walked out the door with the same quiet they had arrived in, and that was the last time I saw them. No calls followed. No letters came. The silence that had once felt like an awkward pause now became something cleaner, something I could breathe inside without guilt. I didn't miss them, not because I never loved them, but because I finally realized how long I had been loving a version of them that never really existed. 3 months later, on a breezy spring morning filled with sun and the smell of fresh coffee, I asked Ivy to marry me again. This time there was no tension, no fear, no lingering sense of needing approval from anyone else. I had already married her once, but this time I meant to do it properly, with a ring, a promise, and a wedding we built ourselves from the ground up. She paused for only a moment before smiling, eyes glassy, cheeks glowing, and whispering, "Yes," like she had been waiting for it since the day we met. A few nights later, we sat at the dining table drafting the guest list, names scribbled on notebook paper, crossing some out, adding others we'd forgotten. Ivy hesitated before asking me, gently, "Have you thought about inviting your parents?" I looked at her across the table, watched the way she asked it not as a challenge or a test, but as someone who genuinely wanted to understand the answer, someone who would never try to change my mind, only hold space for the thoughts I needed to share. I shook my head slowly, letting the words come out without filter or force. "I don't let anyone who's ever hurt you into the place where we're building our life." She didn't speak after that. She just nodded, the way someone does when they respect a boundary not because it's logical, but because it's sacred. That night, as we cleaned up the kitchen and music played low in the background, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit out loud before, that the peace we were creating wasn't something I found accidentally. It was something I had to fight for, step by step, wound by wound, by letting go of a family that had been draining the best parts of me for most of my adult life. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for apologies or hoping for closure. I had already built something better with someone who never once made me feel small, and the future we were shaping no longer had space for people who couldn't understand the cost of the harm they caused. We got married in late June under the open sky behind a small vineyard just outside Columbia, surrounded by tall grass, soft light, and a circle of people who had never made either of us feel like we had to earn our place at their table. The ceremony wasn't extravagant. There were no chandeliers, no choreographed dances, no fake smiles, but there was this quiet warmth to it, the kind of joy that doesn't need to be posted online to feel real. Ivy wore a pale cream dress that floated just above her ankles, her hair braided to one side with wildflowers tucked in, and when I saw her walking down that gravel path toward me, nothing else mattered. Not the guests, not the weather, not the thoughts of who wasn't there. Just her, only her. After the ceremony, we served grilled food from a local barbecue spot and drank local cider until the sun dipped behind the trees. My best friend Jonah gave a toast that made Ivy laugh so hard she cried, and Brooke, who had made the 4-hour drive with her husband and baby bump, pulled me aside and told me she hadn't seen me look this relaxed since we were kids building blanket forts in the living room. We didn't talk about our parents that day. We didn't talk about what they were doing or not doing, or whether they'd ever come around. There wasn't space for that anymore. Not in the world Ivy and I were building from the ground up with our own hands. 3 weeks after the wedding, I got a letter, an actual letter, on stiff paper with embossed initials in the corner, from my father. I opened it while Ivy was watering the balcony herbs, and I read it twice before setting it down without comment. It was short, no more than 5 lines, but every word had been carefully chosen to sound neutral, as if written by a colleague instead of a parent. They were downsizing the house, moving out of Clearwater, something about needing a fresh start, and he hoped I was well. There was no mention of Ivy, no mention of the wedding. No acknowledgement of what had happened that day in the reception hall or the reason we hadn't spoken since. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I finally understood that silence wasn't the absence of love. It was the boundary I had needed all along. That fall, Brooke gave birth to a daughter, and I drove down to see them a few weeks after they settled in. The house was small but clean, and when I held the baby in my arms for the first time, something unspoken settled between me and Brooke, an understanding that we had both survived something, even if we'd taken different paths to do it. She didn't try to apologize for our parents. She didn't try to excuse them. She just said, "Thank you," the way you do when there's too much history behind the words to say anything more. Life moved quietly after that, in the best way possible. Ivy and I spent long evenings cooking together, trading favorite recipes, and playing music through our old speaker until the neighbors knocked politely to ask us to turn it down. On weekends, we took long drives to nowhere, stopping at small towns to walk through antique shops or pick up jars of honey from roadside stands. We made plans without asking for permission. We built holidays around the people who wanted to be there, not the ones who expected it out of obligation. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to check over my shoulder for the next blow, the next manipulation disguised as tradition, the next emotional debt dressed up like family duty. Ivy never once asked again about my parents, not even when their names came up in conversation with someone else. She let them exist in the background of our life the way you let an old photograph stay in a drawer, not destroyed, not forgotten, but kept far enough away that it no longer colors the present. One morning, over coffee on our balcony, she said something I've thought about every day since. She said, "Some people think love is about forgiveness, but I think real love is about protection, knowing where not to let the hurt back in." She didn't mean it as advice, but it hit me harder than anything I'd read in all the books I used to buy trying to make sense of dysfunctional families. Then, earlier this year, I got a text from an unknown number with a photo attached. It was my parents standing in front of a small restaurant with a hand-painted sign and matching polos, both smiling like they hadn't spent the last 3 years pretending I didn't exist. There was no message, just the photo. No follow-up, no attempt to explain. I showed it to Ivy, and she handed the phone back without a word. I deleted it and never responded. That's when I knew, absolutely, without hesitation, that the part of me that had once clung to the hope of fixing things had finally let go. The truth is, family doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes. It gets chipped away little by little, conversation by conversation, until one day you realize that staying silent has cost you more than speaking up ever would have. And when you finally speak, really speak, not out of spite but from a place of clarity, it doesn't fix what's broken, but it does give you the space to build something better somewhere else. That's what Ivy and I have now. Not a perfect life, not a fairy tale, but something real, something earned. And if I could go back and tell my younger self one thing, it wouldn't be to fight harder for approval or to try and please people who never made room for who I actually was. I'd tell him this: the peace you're searching for doesn't live in your parents' acceptance. It lives in the life you're brave enough to create without them. So if you've made it this far, and you're wondering if I was wrong to walk away from a family that still breathes but no longer calls, or to ask for a signed loan at my sister's wedding instead of letting myself be guilt-tripped again, or to build a new family around love instead of tradition, my answer is simple. No, I wasn't wrong. And if you're standing at that same threshold, wondering whether you're allowed to put your own peace first, then let me say this clearly. You don't owe anyone access to the parts of your life they've shown no respect for. Sometimes walking away isn't the end of something broken. It's the beginning of something whole.